causes of death.
I have here the toxicology report, which shows there are a staggering 9 different prescription drugs in Elvis's body at the time of his death.
Almost 50 years of silence, the coroner who examined Elvis Presley in 1977 is finally talking, and what he is saying is shaking the entire world. Did Elvis really die that day, or did the king simply walk away? And if that body was not his, then whose was it? Join us as we uncover the secret that has been buried for nearly 5 decades. The old man with a secret. The room is small and the light is dim, a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The kind of room that feels like it holds secrets, like the air itself is heavy with things unsaid, things buried deep for almost 50 years. He is 79 years old now. This man who once worked in the cold, quiet world of autopsies and official reports. A man who spent his career writing down the truth about how people died. A man whose signature meant something final, something legal, something permanent. But now his hands shake as he sits across from the camera, and his eyes keep moving to the door, like he expects someone to walk in and stop him, like even after all this time, he is still afraid of the answer he is about to give. He clears his throat, he adjusts in his chair, he looks down at his wrinkled hands for a long moment, and then he says the 4 words that change everything. The 4 words he has kept locked inside his chest since the summer of 1977. The words that have followed him through every single day of the last 47 years. Through every birthday, every Christmas, every quiet night when the guilt crept in and sat beside him like an uninvited guest. That body wasn't Elvis. And just like that, the most famous death in rock and roll history cracks open again. Wider than ever before, messier than ever before, more impossible to ignore than ever before. Why now, people will ask? Why wait 47 long years to say something like this? Why carry a secret this enormous for this long? Why not speak sooner? Why not tell someone, a journalist, a friend, a priest, anyone? Why hold it alone for nearly 5 decades? The answer, he says quietly, is fear and guilt, and a phone call he received in 1977 that told him very clearly what would happen if he ever opened his mouth. The king of the world. Go back to 1977, back to a world where Elvis Presley is not just a singer, but something closer to a religion. A man who had changed the sound of everything, who had taken a whole country by the shoulders and shaken it awake with his voice, his hips, his impossible magnetism. He had sold over 500 million records. He had made 33 films. He had performed for crowds so large and so loud that people standing in the back rows said they could feel the sound in their bones, through their shoes, through the concrete floor beneath them. But in the early months of 1977, something around Elvis felt different. Something that the people closest to him could sense but could not quite name. A heaviness, a distance, like a man who was carrying something too large to carry alone. Like a man who had already made a decision that no one else knew about yet. He looked tired in ways that sleep could not fix. His eyes had something behind them that was not sadness exactly, but was close to it. Something like exhaustion that had gone too deep for too long, and some of the people around him, the ones who had known him since the beginning, started to feel a quiet, creeping worry that they could not shake, even in the middle of the loudest shows, even when the crowd was roaring his name. The morning at Graceland. August 16th, 1977. And Graceland is not waking up the way it normally does. There is no music drifting through the halls, no laughter from the kitchen, no sound of boots on the hardwood floors, just a strange and heavy silence that wraps around the whole mansion like a second skin. The kind of silence that does not feel like peace, the kind that feels like it is waiting for something terrible to happen, or like something terrible already has. Elvis had been awake through most of the night, that much was known. He had a habit of staying up until the early hours, reading, watching television, moving through the quiet rooms of Graceland like a ghost in his own home. And the people around him had learned not to question it, had learned to work around his strange hours, his unpredictable rhythms, the way he lived on a schedule that belonged only to him. But by the time the afternoon light was coming through the windows, something felt wrong in a way that was hard to explain. A feeling that spread from person to person without a single word being spoken, the way fear sometimes moves through a building before anyone has named the reason for it. It was Ginger Alden who found him, his girlfriend at the time, a young woman who had been asleep in the bedroom and woke to find him gone, which was not unusual in itself. Elvis often disappeared into other parts of the house during the night, but something made her look. Something pulled her toward the bathroom. And what she found there on the floor would change everything, would set into motion a chain of events that the world is still trying to make sense of nearly 5 decades later. The call went out, and the people inside Graceland began to move fast. Too fast, some would later say. Decisions were being made before anyone had taken a breath, before anyone had truly understood what they were looking at. And the questions that should have been asked in those first few minutes were not asked, or if they were asked. The answers were given too quickly, too cleanly, too neatly for a moment, this enormous and this chaotic. Who made the first call is something that has been debated ever since. The timeline of those early minutes is fuzzy in places. Certain details shift depending on who is telling the story. And that fuzziness, that small but persistent inconsistency, is something that has never fully gone away, no matter how many official statements were made. No matter how many times the story was told and retold and smoothed over. Some people inside Graceland that morning would later say they felt rushed, like the situation was being managed before it was even understood. Like invisible hands were already shaping the story, deciding what it would be, deciding what the world would and would not be told, and all of it happening in the span of just a few desperate, disorienting minutes on an August morning in Memphis that nobody inside those walls would ever forget. The rush to the hospital. The ambulance moved fast through the streets of Memphis, cutting through the afternoon heat with its lights flashing and its siren tearing through the quiet of the day. And the people who happened to be outside at that moment, going about their ordinary Tuesday, had no idea what was inside that vehicle. No idea that the man many considered the greatest entertainer who had ever lived might be lying on a stretcher just a few feet away from them as they stood on the pavement and watched it pass. Baptist Memorial Hospital received the call before the ambulance even arrived. The staff were moving, preparing, doing what they were trained to do. But there was already something unusual about the way this situation was unfolding. Something in the tone of the communication, something in the level of urgency that went beyond the medical, that suggested this was not just an emergency, but an event. Something that needed to be contained as much as it needed to be treated. By the time the vehicle pulled into the hospital, word had begun to spread the way word always spreads in a city. Quietly at first, and then all at once. And reporters were already making their way toward Baptist Memorial, already picking up their cameras and their notebooks, already sensing that something significant was happening, even if they did not yet know what it was. Inside the emergency room, the atmosphere was tense and close. Doctors worked and nurses moved quickly around them, and the security that had arrived alongside the medical team was tight in a way that felt unusual, felt like something beyond standard procedure, like the people managing the situation were thinking about more than just the patient on the table, like they were already thinking about the story that would come after. And it was in this environment, in the middle of all this controlled chaos, that the whispers began. Small and uncertain at first. The kind of thing you brush aside when you first hear it. The kind of thing you tell yourself you imagined. But they did not go away. They persisted, passed from one person to another in the corridors and the break rooms and the quiet corners of that hospital. And what they said was simple but impossible, that the person they had brought in did not look quite right, did not look the way the photographs looked, did not look like the man whose face had been on the cover of every magazine in America for the past 20 years. One nurse, who would not speak publicly for many years, later said that she remembered thinking something felt off in those first moments. Not dramatically, not in a way she could point to and prove. Just a feeling, a small but stubborn feeling that lodged itself in her memory and never left. The feeling that something about this story was not the way it was being told. Inside the autopsy room, the coroner entered the room the way he always did, professionally, quietly, with this particular kind of calm that people who work around death learn to carry with them. A calm that is not coldness exactly, but is close to it. A stillness that comes from doing difficult work for a long time and learning to separate yourself from the weight of it, at least on the surface, at least enough to do the job. He had performed many autopsies before this one, had stood in rooms like this one more times than he could count, had written reports and signed documents and moved on to the next case because that was the work, that was what the job required. And he had always been good at it, always been thorough, always been the kind of professional that his colleagues respected and his superiors relied upon. But from the very first moment in that room, something felt different. Something he could not immediately name, but could not ignore either. Something that sat at the edge of his professional awareness like a splinter. Small enough to dismiss, but persistent enough to stay. The weight was the first thing. The body on the table was heavier than he had expected based on the most recent accounts he had read. Heavier in a way that made him pause, made him look again, made him reach for the measurements and check them twice. And the numbers were not impossible. Weight can fluctuate, especially in a man whose health had been in decline, but it stayed with him. That small arithmetic discrepancy, it did not leave. Then there were the features, and this is the part he would struggle to articulate for decades. The part that sounds like imagination when you say it out loud, but felt like observation. When he was standing there in that room, the features were close. Very close. Close enough that anyone who was not looking carefully would not have noticed anything at all. But he was a man whose entire career was built on looking carefully, on noticing the things that other people walked past. And what he noticed made the splinter push a little deeper. The ears were slightly different from the photographs he had seen. The jawline sat at a small but measurable variation. The hands, which he examined as part of the standard process, did not have the specific calluses and markings he would have expected from a man who had played guitar for over 20 years. And each of these details on its own was explainable, was dismissible, but together they formed something that he could not simply file away and forget. He finished his work, he wrote his notes, he behaved exactly as a professional should. But when he walked out of that room and into the corridor, and the door swung shut behind him, he stood still for a long moment in the fluorescent light of that hallway, and something inside him, something that had nothing to do with paperwork or procedure, told him that the story he had just been asked to confirm was not the whole truth. The pressure from above. He did not have long to sit with his doubts before the world. Outside that autopsy room began to press in, because within hours of the body being brought to Baptist Memorial Hospital, the corridors and the conference rooms and the quiet offices of that building were filling up with people who had not been there before. People in expensive suits with careful faces and measured voices. People whose job it was not to find the truth, but to manage it. The lawyers arrived first, or perhaps it was the managers. The exact order of their arrival is something that different people remember differently. But what everyone agrees on is that they came quickly, faster than you might expect, as if they had been waiting somewhere nearby, as if the call had gone out before the ambulance had even left Graceland, and they moved through the hospital with the quiet confidence of people who already knew how this was going to end. The cause of death needed to be determined, and it needed to be determined fast. That much was made clear in ways both spoken and unspoken. There was a schedule to keep, a public to manage, a machine of enormous commercial and emotional weight that needed to be told something definitive before the rumors filled the silence. And the pressure of all of that landed squarely on the shoulders of the coroner and the medical team, who were still in the middle of doing their work. What followed was not an argument exactly. No one shouted, no one made direct threats. It was all much quieter than that. And in some ways, much more frightening for its quietness. It was a series of conversations that did not quite feel like conversations. Meetings that did not quite feel like meetings. A steady and relentless pressure applied with politeness and with smiles and with the particular kind of authority that does not need to raise its voice because it already knows it will get what it wants. The full autopsy report, the complete and detailed version that would have answered every question, was sealed, locked away from public view for decades. A decision that was presented as a matter of protecting the privacy of the family. But that struck many of the people involved as something more than that, as a door being closed on a room that someone very powerful did not want anyone else to enter. And the coroner, standing in the middle of all of this, a professional man with a career to protect and a family to think about, felt the walls of the situation closing around him, felt the space for honesty shrinking with every passing hour, felt the unspoken message becoming clearer and clearer, sign the document, confirm the story, and then go home and do not look back. Because the people standing in this corridor with their careful smiles and their expensive suits are not asking for the truth. They are asking for something much more useful to them. They are asking for your signature. Oh, the closed casket funeral. The funeral was held on August 18, 1977, just 2 days after the body was found at Graceland, and that speed itself was something people noticed, something that felt rushed in a way that sat uncomfortably with those who were paying attention, because 2 days is not very long to grieve, not very long to make arrangements, not very long to do anything except move quickly and quietly toward a conclusion that someone somewhere had already decided upon. Memphis came to a standstill, the streets outside Graceland filled with tens of thousands of people who had driven or walked or taken buses from every corner of the country, people who were weeping openly on the pavement, people who had brought flowers and photographs and handwritten letters, people whose grief was so raw and so enormous that it spilled out of them onto the street like something physical, like something that could not be contained by any ordinary measure of sadness. And at the center of all of it, in the music room of Graceland, where Elvis had spent so many hours playing and singing and simply existing, there was a casket, a white casket trimmed with silver, and it was closed, and it stayed closed, and for the people who were allowed inside the mansion to pay their respects. That detail registered in a way that was hard to shake. A closed casket at a viewing where people had specifically come to say goodbye felt like a door that had been deliberately locked. The official explanation was that the family wanted to preserve dignity, wanted to protect the memory of Elvis as the world had known him, rather than as illness and time had left him, and that explanation was reasonable. And many people accepted it without question, because grief does strange things to logic, and because sometimes the simplest answer is the true one. But not everyone accepted it. There were people who had known Elvis personally, people who had worked with him and traveled with him, and spent years in his company, and some of those people came away from that closed casket with a feeling they could not explain away, a feeling that something was wrong. Not wrong in a way they could prove, not wrong in a way they could stand up and announce to the world, but wrong in the way that your body sometimes knows a thing before your mind is ready to accept it. One person who attended the private viewing, and who would not speak on record for many years, said simply that the figure in the casket did not carry the presence of Elvis, the witnesses who changed their stories. In the weeks and months and years that followed, August 16, 1977, the people who had been inside Baptist Memorial Hospital that day, the nurses and the orderlies and the technicians and the security staff, began to give interviews, began to speak to journalists and documentary makers and investigators who came looking for pieces of the story. And what emerged from those conversations was not a clean and consistent picture, but something much more complicated. Most of them stuck to the official version, and that is understandable, because the official version was the safe version, the version that did not put your career at risk, or your reputation in danger, or your family in an uncomfortable position. And many of these were ordinary working people who had simply been present at an extraordinary moment, and who had no particular desire to become part of a controversy that was larger than anything they had signed up for. But some of them did not stick entirely to the official version. Some of them allowed small things to slip through, details that did not fit neatly into the story that had been told, details that they mentioned almost in passing, almost as if they did not fully realize the weight of what they were saying. And those details accumulated over the years into something that was impossible to ignore entirely, a collection of small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern. One hospital worker mentioned, in an interview given almost a decade after the event, that the sideburns on the body had struck her as unusual, not wrong exactly, but somehow not quite right, too uniform, too neat for a man who was famous for a particular kind of imperfect lived-in appearance. And she had thought about it briefly at the time, and then set the thought aside because there was work to do, and because thinking that thought to its conclusions was not something she was prepared to do in the middle of a shift. Another witness, a man who had been involved in the transportation of the body, said in a later interview that something about the whole situation had felt staged to him, not in a dramatic way, not in a way he could point to specifically, but in the way that certain scenes feel when you are inside them. A faint sense of performance, of choreography, of people playing roles that had been assigned to them before the curtain went up. And that feeling had never entirely left him, no matter how many years passed. The coroner's breaking point, he is sitting in that small dim room again, the same room where this story began, the lamp throwing its long shadows across the walls, and he looks like a man who has finally put down something very heavy, something he's been carrying for so long that he almost forgot what it felt like to walk without the weight of it, almost forgot that there was a version of himself that existed before the summer of 1977 came and changed everything. He talks about guilt the way people talk about a chronic illness, not as something that arrives suddenly and dramatically, but as something that settled in and slowly, that made itself at home in the quieter corners of his life. That was there in the background of every ordinary moment, every dinner with his family, every morning when he woke up and lay still for a few seconds before the day began, and the memory came back the way it always did. He had been a good professional, he says. He had done his job with care and with integrity for his entire career. And then on one August afternoon in Memphis, he had been asked to do something that was not quite his job, had been asked to sign his name to a version of events that his own observations did not entirely support. And he had done it, and he had told himself at the time that he was protecting people, protecting the family, protecting the peace of a city that was already in grief, and that justification had worked for a while, had been enough to get him through the days and then the years. But justifications have a shelf life, and his had run out somewhere around the time he turned 70, somewhere around the time he started thinking more about the end of his life than the continuation of it. Somewhere around the time the weight of the secret stopped feeling like something he was managing and started feeling like something that was managing him. He was told, he says, in language that was polite but perfectly clear, to sign the documents and move on, to be a professional, to understand that some situations are larger than any individual, and that the role of an individual in those situations is simply to do what is required and then step back and let the larger machinery do its work. And he had understood that message completely. And he had obeyed it completely, and it had cost him something. He was only now, at the end of his life, beginning to fully calculate. Whether he was protecting a grieving family or concealing something far more deliberate is the question he says he cannot answer with certainty. But the question itself, he says, is the thing that has never let him sleep the way he used to sleep. Back before that afternoon in Memphis, when he walked into a room and saw something that did not add up and chose, for reasons that made sense at the time, to add it up anyway. If it wasn't Elvis, then where was he? Where was? And now the story arrives at the question that everything else has been building toward. The question that sits at the center of all the whispers, and the inconsistencies, and the sealed reports, and the closed casket, and the witnesses who changed their stories, and the old coroner sitting in his dim room with his shaking hands and his 50 years of guilt. The question that is either the most important question in the history of popular culture or the most elaborate illusion ever constructed around a simple and tragic death. If the body in that autopsy room was not Elvis Presley, then where was Elvis Presley? Because a man cannot simply disappear from the most scrutinized life in America without leaving some kind of trace, without someone somewhere knowing something, without the truth eventually finding its way to the surface the way truth always does. Slowly and awkwardly, and usually too late to change anything, but always, eventually, out. The people who believe he faked his death point to a collection of details that they have assembled over nearly 5 decades. The misspelling of his middle name on the death certificate, the wax-like appearance of the body that those few who saw it described, the fact that his father Vernon reportedly told at least one person that the body did not look right, the sightings that continued to trickle in from across America for years afterward, ordinary people in ordinary places who looked up from their coffee or their newspaper and saw a face that stopped them cold. Others say that this is what grief does, that grief makes people see what they want to see, that the mind in pain reaches for impossible comfort, that the sightings and the inconsistencies and the sealed documents are all real, but they all have ordinary explanations. And that the simplest explanation, the one that requires the fewest extraordinary assumptions, is that a man who had lived extraordinarily hard for 42 years simply reached the end of what his body could carry. But the coroner's words do not belong to grief. They belong to a man who spent his career in the business of certainty, who built his professional life on the foundation of observable fact, and what he observed in that room in Memphis in the summer of 1977 was not, he says, the body of Elvis Aaron Presley, and he has carried that observation alone for longer than most people carry anything. The camera fades, and the room goes dark, and his final words hang in the silence of that small, dim space. And the legend of Elvis Presley, which was already larger than any single life could reasonably contain, becomes something even the legend itself might not be able to hold.